Good morning, my friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we are completing the entire set of laws of the laws of idol worship. The 12th chapter of the laws of idol worship. Over here the Rambam is going to be discussing, continuing in regards to the laws of things that we're not allowed to do because these are the ways that idol worshippers act and live their life. And therefore we are not allowed to do these things since we are supposed to be separate and not going in the ways of idolatry. So today we're going to be starting off to learn the law of the peyot, as we started mentioning yesterday, in regards to having the small side locks of hair on the sides of our face, as well as discussing the laws of having a beard, which also stem from this mitzvah of not going in the ways of those who serve idols. So the Rambam begins that there is a verse in the Torah where it says, "Do not cut off the corners of your heads." And over here, this is the base of the mitzvah that we're supposed to have these little side locks, which are called peyot, which literally mean the corners of our head. And we are not allowed to remove them. And there is a specific mitzvah for one side and another mitzvah for the other side. And a person would be liable on each one separately. And that's whether a person is shaving off their entire head, including their side locks, or whether they're only cutting off their side locks. In whatever case, they would be liable. And this also includes a child. A child is actually, we are not allowed to cut off also a child, a male, his peyot. And then the Rambam says, but a woman does not have this mitzvah. She is allowed to cut off her side locks because, as the verse continues and says, do not cut off the corners of your heads and do not destroy the corners of your beards. So those who have the commandment in regards to their beard also will have the commandment in regards to their corners of their heads, in regards to the peyot, to the side locks. So since women are not under this mitzvah, they don't have a mitzvah of not allowed to cut their beards. A woman is, if she has some hairs, she's allowed to cut them. So similarly also, in regards to the peyot, she's allowed to cut off the side locks of her head as well. So that is, in general, the Rambam says that we find that in regards to all negative commandments, so every commandment of something which we're not allowed to do, whether it is not to work on Shabbat, or whether it is not to murder, or whether it is any negative commandment, something which we are supposed to not do, women are, just as men have the same liability, so to speak. They have the same law applies to them. So whether it's a man or a woman, everyone is the same in regards to the negative commandments, except in regards to these three mitzvot, three commandments. One is in regards to cutting off the peyot, one is in regards to cutting off the hair of the beard, facial hair, and one is in regards to not becoming impure to a dead body in regards to a kohen. So a woman who is a kohenet, as it would be called, from the priestly family, she would be allowed to get impure for someone who passed away. But those are three specific commandments where there is a different law for women than men. And in regards to positive commandments, so any positive commandment which is bound to a specific time, that when a specific time comes along, you're supposed to do this mitzvah, so then women are exempt. They don't have to do those mitzvahs, except for specific ones. For instance, making kiddush on Shabbat, or eating matzah on Passover, and eating the Passover lamb, and so on. So there are specific mitzvot which a woman would also have a complete obligation to do them. But usually, if it's a mitzvah which is connected to time, for instance, eating in a sukkah, or listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So technically, they are exempt if they are not able to do it. It's okay. If they are able to, then of course they're performing a mitzvah, and they are going to be getting a reward for it, of course. And they're completing the mitzvah, and it's a very positive thing to do. But if they're not able to, so then they are exempt, and it's fine. If they, for whatever reason, they're not able to do it, it's absolutely okay. But that's in general. And if we have someone who is an androgynous, which we're not sure if they're a man or a woman, so then they would have the obligations both of man and woman. And if they transgress one of these specific laws that are specific for a man or specific for a woman, so then they would not be liable, though. Now, although a woman, we said, is not going to be liable, and she's allowed to cut off her own sidelocks, her own peyot, she's not allowed to cut a man's peyot. So in other words, on her own, she's allowed to cut her own facial hair, but she's not allowed to cut a man's facial hair. Now, in regards to the amount of the peyot, how many hairs, how long, how big does it have to be? And I'm sure you've noticed there are various communities that each one have their own customs. Some have it thicker, some have it thinner, some have it longer, some have it shorter. So the Rambam says that there isn't a specific amount, but we have heard from our sages and our elders that there should be at least 40 hairs that are growing a little bit longer. So in other words, they can be quite thin, but they shouldn't be totally cut off. And if it's removed by a scissor, and rather instead of a razor, so then the person would not be liable. So the prohibition is that we should not totally remove those hairs. So with a scissor, you can't actually get all the way to the skin, but rather there's going to still be a little bit left, so then it will be okay. Now he continues on in discussing the laws regarding a beard. So he says that the way of the priests, the pagan priests, was to remove their beards, and therefore the Torah forbids the removal of one's beard. And there are 5 bones in a person's face in what we are not allowed to cut off our hair, which is 2 up here, 2 on the sides, and then 1 in the center. All of these hairs we're not allowed to cut off. On the other hand, a woman is allowed to do it, as we mentioned before. And again, this will apply specifically for a razor, the Rambam says. And the truth is, there's actually a discussion in the Talmud if a person is allowed to cut with a scissor where he's not going to be destroying totally, like we mentioned in regards to the peyot, to the side locks. If a person is allowed to touch, if is allowed to trim their beard, so to speak, down all the way just with a scissor and not entirely cutting it off and really getting into the skin. So we find there is a discussion in this in Jewish law, and various streams of Judaism. You'll find various opinions. In the Hasidic community, we grow beards, thereby, here is my beard. I've never touched it, never trimmed it, never cut it. We follow the opinion, which is the more stringent opinion, that the mitzvah is that we should not at all destroy our beard. It's a sign of blessing. It brings lots of blessing from God, and it's a very positive thing to have it. Now, in regards to a mustache, though, so the Rambam says that the mustache and also the hair over here, which hangs from the lower lip, so you are allowed to remove it, although we don't remove it entirely, but we're allowed to trim it down a little bit, especially if it's getting in the way, interfering with eating and drinking, so then you're allowed to trim it down a little bit. Now, what about the rest of the hair on the body? Regular hair on the rest of the armpits and so on and so forth. So he says that it depends on the community. If a person lives in a place where men do not trim or do not cut the rest of their hair, of their body, so then a man should not do it, depending on the custom of the place. But if it's a place where men do cut down and cut off the rest of their body hair, so then they are allowed to. So it depends on the custom of the place, but he says that in regard to have scissors and cut it off like that, without a razor which is cutting it off entirely, where that will depend on the custom of the place. So with scissors it would be okay in all communities. Now the Rambam continues in discussing the laws of a woman. If I did not mention, a woman is allowed to cut off any other bodily hair. It's totally okay. Now the Rambam discusses the idea of a man should not wear woman's clothing and a woman should not wear man's clothing. And this really depends on the place and the area where a person lives. There's always going to be differences. And Rambam does say that everything is going to be according to the local custom of the place. So if there are specific jewelries and clothing that women wear, so then a man should not wear them, and vice versa. If there are specific things that men wear, so then a woman should not wear them. And this is because it was a form of idol worship where they would switch clothing, and that is something which we should not do. Moving on to the next mitzvah, which is also a form of idol worship, is the idea of not tattooing. The Torah forbids us that we're not allowed to cut our flesh and fill the split with ink or dye, which will leave that will leave an imprint. So this was a custom which idolaters would do, and we are not allowed to do it. Now, if a person only made that cut in the flesh but did not dye it, or the other way, only dyed it and did not do the cut, so then the person would not be liable, although it's not allowed. But the idea of a full-on tattoo would include both these components. If a person will only be fully liable if they did that, they tattooed themselves. But if someone else tattooed them, so then it's not allowed, but they would not be liable in the same way. But if he helped out that tattooist, if whatever it's called, then they would be liable. Now there's another mitzvah which is called when a person would gouge themselves, if that's how you pronounce this word. After when a person passed away, there was a custom which idol worshippers would do, which they would like make a cut or like a deep scratch in their body, and that's something which we're not allowed to do. And gashing and gouging, I don't know how you say this, and are not allowed to be done because it was a pagan custom that they would do in a time of grief after a person passed away. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. And for every gash which a person might, God forbid, do to themselves would be another sin and would be liable for each one in their for that scratch. Now, in regards to this prohibition, where the term the Torah uses is lo titgodedu, which would mean do not gash. Now, that word lo titgodedu also has another translation, which means do not separate, and do not group into various groupings. That's another translation for the same word. And the Rambam says that in regards to this law, there is another understanding of this law in a totally different context, where we say that if we have a city, we should not have two separate not have two separate houses of law. In other words, two courthouses which follow different customs in one single city, because this will bring to great strife and lots of fights and so on and so forth. And we understand it to be saying that we should not separate into various groupings, but rather we should be in unity. Now comes another law, which is in regards, and also another form of idol worship, which they would, after a person passed away, they would make bald spots in their hair. So that's, between their eyes. That's something which we're not allowed to do. And after that person, we're not allowed to harm ourselves as a sign of grief. So even if a person, for every bald spot there would be another liability. A person would be liable. So if a person had 5 bald spots, he would be liable 5 times. And so that's something which we're not allowed to do. Now, if a person does if he does any of these above mentioned things, for instance, he makes a gash, or he gouges himself, or he makes a bald spot in his head, so then if it's for a dead person, so then that they would be liable, because that's the original form of the idol worship. But if the person just does it for a calamity that took place because his ship sank at sea, or because his house collapsed, or for another reason like that, for a personal grief that he is grieving about, so then he would not be liable, although it's something which we're not allowed to do, but still they would not be liable for it. If a person does one of these actions to another person, so in other words, he doesn't do it to himself, but rather they're doing it to someone else, so then if the other person was helping him to do it, so then they would both be liable. But if one of them was doing it, so then the person who is doing it would be liable. And if one of them was doing it purposely and one was doing it by mistake, so then again the one who is doing it purposely, intentionally, would be liable, and the one who is doing it inadvertently would be not liable. So it will be exempt. So with this, we have completed the laws of idol worship, all 12 chapters of them. It was quite a trek, and we got quite involved over here in all the depths of all the laws. And we really got a full picture of what Jewish law has to say about the idea of idolatry. And as we spoke a few times already, we have to understand the fundamental of how deep and great is this foundation of belief in God, that we are not allowed to get close. We're not allowed to get close with a 10-foot pole from anything that has to do with idolatry. So therefore, there are very strict and severe laws in regards to the idea of idolatry, and we have to keep ourselves very far away from thinking about it, learning about it, or getting involved in it in any shape or form. So with that, we have completed all the laws of idol worship in the Rambam, in the Book of Knowledge, and we're going to be starting tomorrow, God willing, a new set of laws, the last set of laws for this book, the laws of repentance, which with this the Rambam completes the first book of Rambam. So we will see you tomorrow, God willing. We're very excited for the new set of laws. We will see you.